Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're located today. Firstly, let me introduce myself. My name is Elliot Harper, and I'm a Senior Marketing Technology Architect at CloudKettle. I've been working with Salesforce Marketing Cloud for almost a decade now. I've written books on Marketing Cloud, and I'm very active in the user community. And this year, I've spent a considerable amount of time working very closely with privacy and data management, designing architectural patterns to enable customers to comply with new and emerging data privacy regulations. Now, Ryan, perhaps you can explain your role at CloudKettle and a bit about your background.
Yeah, thanks, Elliot. Hey everyone, I'm Ryan O'Sullivan. I'm a Salesforce System Architect here at CloudKettle. I've been working in the Salesforce consulting industry for around the past 5 years, and I hold a pretty heavy passion for development best practices, engaging and educating my local community on Salesforce development, and constantly seeking ways to optimize the general process of creation.
Thanks, Ryan. Now, before we begin, I wanted to explain this is a live webinar, and we're really keen to answer your questions. But to help the session flow, we won't be pausing to accept questions during our presentation. Instead, you can post your questions to the Q&A panel, which is located in the tray in Zoom, which John McGinley, one of our partners at CloudKettle, will review, and will answer them at the end of the session. In today's session, we'll be covering the following topics, and as I just explained, we'll answer any questions at the end of our presentation. Now, we provide our consent every day, often without second thought. We've adapted to automatically clicking through those distracting accept buttons on website pop-ups, or those obligatory checkboxes when completing various web forms. No matter what the activity is, it seems there's always a requirement to consent to something. But what's up with all those annoying pop-ups and checkbox fields? Well, the regulatory landscape is on the move. What started with a General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, in Europe, is now rippling across continents. Recent regulations include the CCPA in California and the LGPD in Brazil. Then there's India's upcoming Personal Data Protection Bill, or PDPB, which is set to become one of the strictest and most comprehensive data privacy laws globally. And this is just the beginning. We should anticipate similar regulations popping up for years to come. While these current and emerging data protection regulations may vary, one common trait they all share is their primary aim, which is to give individuals control over their personal data, while also requiring organizations to establish a legal basis for processing such data. Determining a legal basis for processing data is key, as all these regulations state that data can only be processed if there's at least one legal basis for doing so. While legal bases vary by regulation, one common basis that's shared across all regulations is consent, and consent is always required for marketing. Now, many of you may be wondering, what if I already have a preference center? There's often ambiguity on the differences between capturing consent and the role of email preference centers. Some assume that the role of a preference center is consent management, but it's not. Consent management and preference management serve different purposes. Consent management determines which individuals provided consent, why they did, via which channel, and what they actually consented to. On the other hand, preference management enables individuals to choose their preferred communication frequency, interests, and alternative options to unsubscribing. However, while consent and preference management differ by function, both support each other. Individuals have a right to revoke their consent at any time, and a preference center is a common channel for individuals to exercise this right. As a result, preference management needs to be tightly coupled to consent management. Now, Salesforce has been thinking about consent management for some time. Over the past 2 years, Salesforce has quietly phased in new storage objects that have come together to form a comprehensive, canonical data model that manages all different aspects of an individual's consent. In the Spring 18 release, we saw the introduction of the individual object, which has since been complemented with several other consent-related objects, from the Spring 19 release right up to the current release. These consent management objects are now available across all Salesforce editions and provide a highly normalized data structure that accommodates the many different aspects of privacy and consent of an individual, while also enabling organizations to align with current and emerging regulatory environments. Probably the most significant aspect of these objects is that, unlike other standard Salesforce objects, they don't count towards storage. Now, this is a highly unusual and somewhat radical direction for Salesforce, as their licensing model has always been based, in part, on storage, where an individual record accounts for 2 to 8 kilobytes of storage resources, depending on object type. These consent management objects have been designed with privacy in mind. The object model closely aligns to privacy by design principles. Specifically, at a holistic level, it provides a proactive data model. So, rather than waiting for privacy risks to occur, it prevents them from occurring in the first place through an organized and standardized set of objects that align tightly to the properties of real-world entities. Additionally, the data model provides an architectural pattern for organizations to embed privacy into the design and architecture of their IT systems and business processes, rather than bolted on as an afterthought. As a result, privacy becomes an integral component of the data model, without diminishing functionality. The following diagram illustrates all currently available consent management objects and their relationships. The objects coloured in orange keep track of data related to authorization forms, such as terms of service, privacy policies, and other consent forms. Each authorization form object stores different data, and you can use them together to create a full picture of an individual's consent to the authorization form. The objects in purple are for storing and managing data related to communication subscriptions, such as newsletters or announcements. Different communication subscription objects store different data, such as how the customer consented to the communication subscription and their preferred contact timing. And finally, the objects in grey are used to store general consent data, which includes the legal basis for contacting someone, the channel used to contact them, and the information related to an individual's consent. The Salesforce Consent Management Object Model broadly classifies consent across 4 different levels, which can be summarized as who provided consent, which channels they consented to being contacted on, via which channel address, and what type of content they consented to. Each of these different levels use related consent management objects in Salesforce to manage and store consent-related data. Let me now explain each level in turn. This initial level establishes who the person is and determines what they have consented to at the broadest level. It stores the consent data in the individual object, where an individual can either be a lead, a contact, a user, a person account record, or any permutation of these object types, or none of them. The intent of the individual object is to abstract privacy data from the lead, contact, user, or person account record, and specifically capture the privacy don'ts for an individual, which include don't process personal data, including collecting, storing, and sharing personal data. Don't solicit products and services. Don't profile or process data for predicting personal attributes, such as interests, behavior, and location. And finally, don't track website session activity and email engagement, such as email opens and clicks. Additionally, the individual object also provides individuals with the ability to exercise their right to be forgotten through a Forget This Individual field, and their right to access their personal data through an Export Individuals Data field. This next level determines which channels the individual wants to be contacted through. The contact point type consent object defines the named channels, for example phone or email, and the related opt-in status of an individual for each corresponding channel. An entity relationship exists between this object and the contact point email and contact point phone objects, which both define what time and in which time zone an individual prefers to be contacted. Additionally, the contact point type consent object always references the data use purpose object, which is the reason for contacting an individual, and the data use legal basis object, which is the legal basis for contacting an individual. This third level identifies the specific address or addresses that the individual wants to be contacted on. The contact point address object is used to store different addresses for an individual. For example, an individual may have both an office address and a home mailing address. The contact point consent object represents an individual's consent to be contacted via a specific contact point, such as an email address or phone number. And similar to the contact point type consent object, contact point consent is also tied to the data use purpose and data use legal basis objects. This final level determines what type of content the individual consents to and by which channel. The communication subscription object defines the different communication types, for example, a newsletter or announcements, which has a relationship to the communication subscription consent object that tracks an individual's consent against their subscription. Additionally, the communication subscription channel type object defines the engagement channel used to contact the individual for each subscription. Like levels 2 and 3, it's also tied to the data use purpose and data use legal basis objects. Now, I'm going to hand over to Ryan, who's going to show us Salesforce Consent Management in action.
Great, thanks, Elliot. So to put into perspective the multiple levels of consent Elliot has just covered, I'm going to be presenting a demo of a Salesforce Lab solution called Consent Capture, which gives a visual walkthrough for managing individual consent. The first thing we'll see is this package provides a nice application view which opens up a few of the tabs for some of the consent objects we just talked about. You can see at the top we have the data use legal basis, which represents that legal basis for contacting an individual, and besides that is the data use purpose, which is the reason for contacting that individual. You can also see here the contact point type consent, which represents individual marked consent for a channel. But for now, let's just dig into a data use purpose record. And here we can see that each data use purpose links up to a legal basis and also includes a description to define what that data use purpose is for. If we dig in a little bit further, you can see that there's also this additional option to allow the user to opt out of that data use purpose. Now to give a demonstration of this flow, I'm going to go into one of our contacts here. And you can see at the top right, we have this consent capture button that's been added. This will launch our flow that's been provided for us. So the first screen is going to give us kind of a list of abilities that are required to run through this flow. We're going to press next. Now, since there is not an individual record for this contact right now, this screen is going to show us that we need to create one. So it's going to automatically do that for us just by pressing next. So we'll do that. Great, now an individual record has been created and connected to our contact. If I press next again, we now see our legal basis reasons at the top here. And underneath are the data use purposes that are tied to those data use legal bases. So for our example, we're going to go under consent, and we're going to use the event communications data use purpose, and we'll press next. So now we have to choose a type for our consent, and because we know that our event communications are done via email, we'll choose email and press next. So now we actually get to set how long this consent is valid for. In doing so, it will automatically calculate the consent expiration date. We can also see on the screen how we are opting that individual in for that record, whether we are opting them in without them knowing, or if they have seen this consent, or if we are explicitly opting them in. In this example, we'll say that we've calling them on the phone and explicitly opted them in verbally. We'll click next. Now we can actually say how we got this consent. This is important as most regulations require this to be documented. Since this was a verbal consent, we'll state that up here. And because this was done over the phone, we'll click phone and we'll press next. Great, now we've finished walking through the wizard and our consent has been registered. Another good thing about this package is that it includes a Lightning component that gives us a visual representation of what we've just created. So under email here, we can see the event communications channel, and we can see that we have a green check mark indicating that this contact has been consented into that event communications emails. We briefly touched on the contact point type consent earlier in this demo, and we can actually drill into that just by pressing through the UI here. Now on this detail page, you can see the flow has populated a lot of values for us, linking to both our individual record and the data use purpose. There's quite a lot of data here, and you can imagine if you were to ask your users to do this manually, there would be a high probability for mistakes. So having that flow wizard to help walk us through really helps simplify that process. One additional thing I'd like to demonstrate here is how that expiration date affects the consent. So if I were to go to this effective to date here, and I'm just going to set this to yesterday. Press save. Now that this is expired, if I go back to that contact and review that consent under email, we can see that where there used to be a green check mark, there's now a red X indicating that we no longer have this contact's consent to communicate to them with our event communications. The great thing about this whole wizard that we just walked through is that it's all done with Salesforce flows. So you can actually customize that to your business logic if you needed to modify that at all. Now, you may have watched this demo and thought to yourself, I have way too many contacts to be manually monitoring all of their consent like this, which brings me to the next feature I wanted to talk about, which is the consent event stream. So what is the consent event stream? Well, the consent event stream is a new feature which has just been released as part of Winter 21. This feature uses change data capture on all the consent management objects that we just reviewed today, enabling external systems to subscribe to streaming events which are published when changes occur to any consent management object. If you are familiar with the Streaming API or Comet D, you'll now be able to leverage both of those to monitor changes made to consent objects. This event stream aggregates all notifications from objects into a single event stream, which means you'll have to parse the returns for that particular update that you're looking for. For example, if you're looking for updates strictly to the individual object. The benefit that it provides a real-time feed of consent data to external platforms, so organizations can be aware when consent events occur within Salesforce. And this could trigger a process, for example, purging customer data when an individual exercises their right to be forgotten. Well, Salesforce already offers a comprehensive SOAP and REST API just for interfacing with objects in Salesforce. There's a Salesforce Consent API, which provides the ability to retrieve consent settings for both the lead, contact, the user, the person account, or individual object records within Salesforce. This READ API returns aggregated consent data based on an action or actions, for example, email, track, or should forget. In turn, the Consent API provides a convenient method for aggregating and resolving consent data for an individual, without the need to invoke multiple API calls or traverse across complex object relationships. As a result, digital marketing platforms can leverage this API to determine if an individual has consented to receiving communications, and for what specific purpose. I'd now like to share some roadmap items that we can expect to see in an upcoming release. But before I do that, I first need to remind you that Salesforce is a publicly traded company and you need to base your purchasing decisions on products or services that are already available. So while the Salesforce consent management objects do provide a very comprehensive and highly normalized data model as they are, we can expect to see some additional objects added to complement that data model, specifically a party role object, which will enable the relationship type of an individual to be determined. For example, a customer versus an employee, or let's say a patient versus a doctor. Additionally, you can also expect to see a new internal business unit object, which is designed for organizations with multiple different brands. For example, a retail group. So this object will allow an individual's consent to be related to one or more specific brands within an organization. Well, thank you very much for attending the session today. We've covered a lot of ground, and we hope you now have a better understanding of why consent management is important, considering the emerging regulatory landscape, and how to use Salesforce's consent management canonical data model to manage an individual's consent, while also complying to data privacy regulations. We now have time for some questions, and I see there are a few questions that have popped up in the QA panel. I'll pass it over to John to walk through some of those.
Perfect. Thanks, Ryan. Great presentation again this evening, guys. I think the group was a little quieter than this afternoon, but a couple good questions nonetheless. Start with the maybe a couple of easier ones. Elliot, are all of these consent management objects available as synchronized data extensions in Marketing Cloud?
It's a great question. So the answer is yes and no. I mean, these are standard objects, and they should be, is the answer. The majority of them are today. However, there are a handful, I think from memory, like half a dozen that aren't currently available by default. But this will be addressed in an upcoming release. It's basically related to the version of the Marketing Cloud connector, and more specifically the API that's being used. But this is a known issue, and you can expect to see this in an upcoming release, perhaps even the release this week. I'm not sure.
Fantastic, thank you. Ryan, one for you. Why do we need individual objects instead of using lead or contact for consent?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the individual object actually ties together the lead and contact objects to kind of make a singular source for a human being. For example, you may already have a contact in your system, and a lead may be populated for that same human with a form request or something. Individual object would be the center point that both of those objects look up to.
Gotcha. Perfect. Now one from Abraham. Is the consent capture dialog box out of the box, or is this custom Lightning components?
The consent Lightning page that you saw is actually provided in the Salesforce Lab solution called Consent Capture. This is just on the App Exchange, and you can get it for free.
And if I could just add to that as well, so the raw source code is also publicly available. You can just, if you Google search for GitHub space consent-capture, you'll see Stefan Chandler Garcia's GitHub repository. He is the developer evangelist at Salesforce, and he created the consent capture app. So all of the code is available for you to go and take and reuse as required.
Yeah, and that code would refer to the visual Lightning component that we saw at the end there when I was drilling through the UI. The wizard is actually all screen flow components, and those are just within Salesforce there.
Perfect, thank you very much. Well, gentlemen, that is the only questions that have been asked by the group today. We did have a couple that we talked about this afternoon, and Elliot, did you want to maybe circle back on a little bit? There were a few questions this afternoon with the consent object and its interplay with Marketing Cloud. Did you want to give that just a quick, maybe 2 minutes?
Sure, of course. So consent management is, this is really a storage model at the moment exclusively for Sales and Service Cloud. One of the questions we had earlier is how does this integrate with other platforms like Pardot or Salesforce Marketing Cloud? The answer is it doesn't today, at least not out of the box. So one of the main paradigms which you're probably aware of is that with Salesforce Marketing Cloud, a subscriber can only be a lead, a contact, or a user. Not an individual. Yet, the whole notion behind the consent management object is everything rolls up to an individual. However, with the new Customer Audiences 360, which is the CDP platform, which was just went generally available last week from Salesforce, we see that you can import, or you do by default import individual records. So this is, perhaps a nod from Salesforce of support that we can expect to see very soon. But at the moment, if you want to, for example, you've got a custom preference center, and you want to go and use some of those communication subscription objects, you're going to have to go and firstly synchronize them with synchronized data extensions, and then create SQL queries to, I guess, normalize the view back to a lead or contact. So the lead and contact standard objects have an individual ID field, which is a standard field, which is available from the synchronized data extension. So you'll need to use that in addition to synchronizing the individual record and to create that relationship yourself. But again, I mean, I was told by the product owner that the team are now working very closely with both Pardot and Salesforce Marketing Cloud, and I think we can expect to see this very soon.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, Ryan, maybe another one for you from earlier today that a number of people were asking about the relationship between the individual and multiple emails or multiple contact records and how that is rationalized or recognized.
So the individual object itself actually does have an email field that you can populate. However, in the scenario where you have multiple emails representing one person, you can use the email contact point that's tied. It's a many-to-one relationship with the individual object. So you can use that object to kind of refer to multiple different email addresses. Same with phone numbers as well. There's a phone contact point.
Perfect, thank you. All right, guys, we have just a quick question here. Any noteworthy limitations to consider while migrating consents being stored in contact point objects?
No limitations. They're actually a bit of a vague question, I suppose, because you could have multiple different fields representing multiple different types of consent in your contact object today. If you wanted to migrate that over to the individual object, you're going to have to create individual records for all of those contacts that you have today. You're also going to have to divvy up your contact consent that you have on the contact record today into daily use purpose records and tie those to legal bases. The problem here is the new model is quite normalized compared to just keeping everything in one contact record. So there's going to be quite a lot of work to break that apart into this new data model. Go ahead, Elliot.
Yeah, so I can expand on that as well. I mean, I'd say the most common pattern of how people manage consent today, at least for email communications, is the has opted out of email field, the standard field on the lead or contact object. And, with the new consent management objects, that really becomes somewhat redundant. And it's more of a kind of a legacy field. So, but as Ryan pointed out, you need to go and process the data in order to go and populate the respective consent management objects. And something to stress here that these consent management objects are just objects. I mean, it's just storage. You have to go and build your own processes and flow to go and process the data. And one assumption that some people incorrectly make is that it will go and create my individual record, and populate that individual ID. It doesn't do any identity resolution. You have to go and do that for you. And of course, that process is going to differ depending on what your data looks like.
Perfect, thank you. Unless there are any other questions, I am going to go back to the panelists. I want to say thank you very much for all of your wisdom this evening, and give you a chance to kind of wrap. Any final thoughts, Elliot, that you'd like to leave us with? I think this is a sort of a new world and very exciting and very relevant for a lot of folks out there. It's like you said, in the age of consent, it's a new world. So.
Yeah, yes, it is. And look, it's something that I encourage everyone to start thinking about very seriously. And we've seen, I'm in Melbourne, Australia, and just this year we've seen a couple of high-profile consent breaches where customers have opted out and yet still received emails, and they've been fined millions of dollars. So this is clearly something you need to take very seriously. And I'd say kind of also the main stumbling block and why these kind of privacy by design breaks is where people don't consider exception conditions. So what if someone chooses to opt out, but that's not recorded, which is generally, I'd say that when these events occur, that's the root cause. So anyway, so I'd just encourage you to start thinking about it. And again, I've as Salesforce has indicated that this is an ongoing an evolutionary platform. So kind of pay close attention to upcoming new objects and features, and think about how you can start using them in your organization.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, Ryan, last word to you, my friend.
Yeah, we had a few questions earlier, and it seems like people are trying to figure out how to kind of jump the gap into this new data model and start kind of leveraging Salesforce for these purposes. And to Elliot's point, which is a great point, really this is just, and I'm just going to reiterate it here, really you're just holding, this is just a storage model, so you do have to incorporate those processes. And there's a lot of integrations that you may be looking for, like Pardot or into Marketing Cloud, that aren't fully flushed out at this moment in time yet. Those are things you should definitely keep an eye out for, because I would predict that it's going in that direction. Leveraging the fact that this data model within Salesforce has really, you're not limited by data storage in this sense, because they're giving you free data, which is great to take advantage of. I think it's a good path forward, and definitely keep an eye out for new feature releases on this topic.
Terrific. Well, thank you. So I guess maybe you aren't going to get the last word, Ryan. Maybe it will be me. I just wanted to take a moment to thank you both once again. Thank you for everyone who has attended this evening. And I did want to say, give you a heads up or a special sneak preview that we've already scheduled our next webinar. And it's a webinar on preference management best practices, and it's scheduled for December 9th. So for those of you who are in attendance and those who have registered and are watching this on YouTube, we will be providing links in the email as well as in the video itself. The upcoming webinar, you'll learn how to effectively manage marketing preferences for your customers across email and mobile channels. We'll be sharing examples of preference center design, in addition to best practice architectural patterns and considerations for orchestrating preference data across various platforms. So that will be hosted by Elliot Harper and the Director of Salesforce Marketing Cloud at CloudKettle, Greg Bates. So I am looking forward to that one as well. So again, everyone, thank you for attending, and I will sign off for today. Thanks again.